There are moments in war when the rules of survival collapse entirely, when ammunition runs out and men discover what they're truly made of. On a barren ridge in the Pacific, 235 Marines climbed a coral hill. By dawn, only 14 could still stand. Between those hours lay a night so desperate that grown men threw rocks at their enemies, so dark that the living couldn't tell themselves apart from the dead, and so savage that when the fighting finally stopped, the survivors couldn't speak about what they'd done. This is what happened on Hill 100. The island shouldn't have mattered. Peleliu was a speck in the vastness of the Pacific, 6 miles of coral and jungle that most Americans couldn't find on a map. But in September 1944, it stood between the United States Navy and the Philippines, and that made it worth dying for. Intelligence officers promised the island would fall in 4 days. They were counting on naval bombardment to soften Japanese defenses, on marine aggression to overwhelm whatever remained. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known from aerial photographs and captured documents, was that the Japanese had learned from every previous island battle. They had studied American tactics at Tarawa, analyzed the failures at Saipan, and concluded that dying on the beaches accomplished nothing. So they dug deeper. They carved their defenses into the island's interior, into a brutal landscape of razor-sharp coral ridges that the Marines would come to call the Umurbergal. The Japanese called it their fortress. The Marines would call it Bloody Nose Ridge, and they would learn its geography one corpse at a time. Captain Everett Pope didn't know any of this when his landing craft ground against the reef on September 15th. He knew his mission, knew his men, knew that Company C of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines had trained for this moment until the movements became muscle memory. He watched his Marines vault over the sides of their Amtraks into chest-deep water, watched them struggle through the surf with 60 pounds of equipment dragging at their shoulders, watched the first mortar rounds begin to fall. The beach was chaos painted in coral dust and salt spray. Explosions walked across the reef in methodical lines. Machine gun fire cut the air into invisible geometry that men learned to navigate or died trying. Pope moved through it the way he'd been trained, assessing, directing, keeping his Marines moving inland because stopping meant dying. They pushed across the airfield, secured their initial objectives, and began to realize that intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The Japanese weren't broken. They were waiting. For 3 days, Company C ground its way through terrain that seemed designed specifically to kill Marines. The coral ridges rose like broken teeth from the jungle floor, each one fortified, each one defended by soldiers who had no intention of surrendering. There were no front lines in any traditional sense. The Japanese controlled the heights and the caves, emerging to attack and then vanishing into passages that intelligence maps didn't show. Every yard forward cost blood. Every small victory revealed another ridge behind it. Pope watched his company shrink. Men he'd trained with, laughed with, trusted with his life, disappeared into the meat grinder of the Umurbergal. A platoon leader shot through the throat. A machine gun team buried by a mortar strike. A rifleman who simply stopped moving forward and had to be dragged to cover, his mind gone somewhere Pope couldn't follow. By the 3rd day, Company C had been reduced from 235 Marines to 90. The survivors were hollow-eyed and filthy, their uniforms stiff with dried sweat and coral dust, their hands blistered from climbing the sharp ridges. They'd stopped talking much. There wasn't anything left to say. On September 19th, Pope received orders that made no tactical sense. Battalion wanted Hill 100 taken. The objective was a coral ridge roughly 500 yards long, shaped like a broken fist thrust up from the jungle. It dominated the surrounding terrain, which made it valuable. It was also completely isolated from friendly positions, which made it a death trap. Pope studied the ridge through his field glasses and understood immediately that taking Hill 100 meant being cut off. There were no covered approaches, no way to reinforce once they were up there, no hope of resupply unless the entire battalion advanced to link up with them. He could see Japanese positions on the surrounding ridges. They would have clear fields of fire on anyone trying to reach Hill 100. But orders were orders, and Pope had learned long ago that questioning them accomplished nothing. He gathered his platoon leaders and explained the situation in terms stripped of everything except the essential truth. They were going to climb that ridge, they were going to dig in, and they were going to hold it until battalion caught up. Nobody asked the obvious question. What happens if Battalion doesn't catch up? The assault began in late afternoon with Company C reduced to fewer than 90 Marines. They moved in a ragged line across open ground, taking fire from three sides, losing men before they even reached the base of the ridge. The coral slope was almost vertical in places, 40 degrees of razor-sharp rock that tore through uniforms and opened hands to the bone. They climbed in the heat of the Pacific afternoon, hauling their weapons and ammunition, pulling each other up the steepest sections, knowing that Japanese soldiers were above them preparing to contest every foot. Pope climbed near the front not because he needed to prove anything, but because his Marines needed to see him there. Leadership wasn't abstract. It was physical presence in the moment when men were deciding whether to keep climbing or let themselves fall. Halfway up, a Japanese machine gun opened fire from a concealed position. 3 Marines went down before anyone could locate the source. A bazooka team worked their way into position and put a rocket through the cave entrance, silencing the gun, but the damage was done. They'd lost time and men, and the sun was dropping toward the horizon. They reached the top as evening approached. The summit of Hill 100 was a nightmare of broken coral, sharp as broken glass, offering no natural cover and no soil deep enough for proper foxholes. Pope walked the perimeter and understood they were completely exposed. Behind them, the ground dropped away in cliffs that made retreat impossible. In front of them, the coral rolled away toward Japanese positions that were now at eye level or higher. To their flanks, more ridges rose like fortress walls. They could see everything, which meant everything could see them. Pope did the calculations in his head. 90 Marines to hold a perimeter of roughly 500 yards. That meant 1 man every 5 or 6 yards, with no reserves, no depth to the defense, no way to rotate men off the line. And night was coming. On Peleliu, night meant the Japanese owned the battlefield. The Marines tried to dig in. They used entrenching tools to scrape shallow depressions in the coral, piling loose rock around the edges to create something resembling fighting positions. The coral shattered under their tools, sending up clouds of white dust that coated everything and everyone. Some positions were barely deep enough to hide a prone man. Others were just scrapes in the rock that offered psychological comfort and nothing else. Pope moved along the line, checking positions, making sure his men understood the defensive plan. They would fight from these positions as long as they could. If the Japanese broke through anywhere, the nearest squad would counterattack immediately. There would be no fallback position because there was nowhere to fall back to. They would hold or they would die trying, and Pope didn't bother pretending there were other options. His Marines understood. They'd been fighting for 3 days. They knew how this island worked. As darkness fell, Pope realized they had a catastrophic supply problem. The climb had consumed most of their water. The fighting had burned through ammunition at rates that peacetime training never anticipated. He gathered his platoon leaders and conducted an inventory. The numbers were worse than he'd feared. Each Marine had roughly 2 magazines remaining for his M1 Garand. The machine gun teams had perhaps 500 rounds between them. They had a handful of grenades, some rifle grenades, and nothing else. No mortar support because the mortars couldn't reach the summit. No artillery support because they were too close to Japanese positions and any shells would land on both sides. No resupply because the route up was exposed to Japanese fire and Battalion had no men to spare for a relief column. They were alone on that ridge with enough ammunition for perhaps 30 minutes of sustained combat. After that, it would come down to knives and fists and rocks. Pope made a decision that would define everything that followed. He ordered strict fire discipline. No shooting unless targets were clearly identified and within effective range. Single shots only, no automatic fire. They needed to make every bullet count, but more importantly, they needed to convince the Japanese that Company C was stronger than it actually was. If the enemy realized how depleted they were, how isolated, how low on ammunition, they would throw everything at Hill 100 and overwhelm the position through sheer mass. So Pope told his Marines to hold their fire, to choose their targets carefully, and to make noise when they weren't shooting. Yell at each other. Call out phantom enemy positions. Make it sound like there were 200 Marines on that ridge instead of 90. The deception had to be perfect because their lives depended on it. The first attack came around midnight. It wasn't a full assault, just a probe, A small group of Japanese soldiers moving up the slope to test the defenses and gauge the response. They came quietly, expertly, using every fold in the coral for cover. Pope's Marines heard them before they saw them. The sound of boots on rock, the metallic click of equipment, the whispered commands in Japanese that carried in the still night air. Someone fired. Then everyone was firing, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness, tracers drawing red lines across the black, the noise bouncing off the surrounding ridges until it was impossible to tell where anything was happening. The Japanese withdrew after a few minutes. They'd learned what they needed to know. The Marines were alert, dug in, and apparently well armed. They'd try again. The attacks came in waves throughout the night, each one larger than the last, each one probing a different section of the perimeter. The Japanese were methodical. They'd attack from the north, draw fire, fall back, then hit from the east an hour later. They were mapping the defensive positions, counting the weapons, calculating how many Marines stood between them and the summit. Pope understood what they were doing and couldn't stop it. His Marines were spread too thin. They couldn't refuse any attack without risking a breakthrough. So they fought from their shallow positions, firing carefully, conserving ammunition, and slowly, inexorably, running out of bullets. Around 0200 hours, one of the machine guns went silent. Pope crawled to the position and found the gunner holding an empty ammunition can. They were out. The gun was useless now, just 40 pounds of metal that couldn't help them. Pope told the gunner to stay in position anyway, to keep moving, to make noise, to make the Japanese think the gun was still operational. By 0300 hours, half the Marines were effectively out of ammunition. They had single magazines remaining, sometimes less. They were parceling out individual rounds, trading bullets like currency, trying to maintain the illusion of strength. And that's when someone had the idea that would save their lives. One of the platoon leaders, Lieutenant Davis, suggested they use the coral itself as a weapon. The coral was everywhere, broken chunks ranging from fist size to fragments the size of baseballs. What if they started throwing rocks mixed with their remaining grenades? The Japanese wouldn't be able to tell the difference in the dark. They'd hear objects landing around them, assume they were all grenades and scatter. It might buy them time. It might make the Japanese hesitant to press their attacks. Pope considered the idea for perhaps 5 seconds before approving it. They didn't have options. They had desperation and rocks. The next time the Japanese attacked, Company C threw everything. Real grenades went out first, detonating with sharp cracks that lit the slope in flickering orange. Then came the rocks, dozens of coral chunks hurled into the darkness, clattering against stone, bouncing down the slope, sounding exactly like grenades that hadn't detonated yet. The effect was immediate and profound. The Japanese advance stopped. Men scattered, diving for cover, waiting for explosions that would never come. By the time they realized they'd been deceived, the Marines had thrown another volley, this time with 1 or 2 real grenades mixed in to maintain the uncertainty. The Japanese fell back again. They'd learned that advancing uphill 100 meant advancing through a constant rain of explosives, and that kind of attack required preparation, covering fire, coordination. It bought Pope's Marines another hour. But the respites were temporary and grew shorter with each attack. The Japanese were bringing up reinforcements, preparing for a major assault. Pope could hear them assembling on the lower slopes, could hear officers barking orders, could hear the mechanical sounds of weapons being prepared. His Marines were exhausted beyond anything training had prepared them for. They'd been fighting for 4 days straight. They'd climbed a vertical ridge in full equipment. They'd been throwing rocks for hours. Some men were so tired they'd fall asleep between attacks, then snap awake when the shooting started, disoriented and terrified. Others stayed awake but drifted into a state beyond exhaustion where thoughts became slippery and the line between what was happening and what they imagined began to blur. Pope moved constantly along the perimeter, checking positions, redistributing ammunition 1 bullet at a time, talking to his Marines in a low, steady voice that somehow cut through the chaos. He told them they were doing well. He told them reinforcement was coming. He told them they just had to hold until dawn. He wasn't sure any of it was true, but the lies were necessary. His Marines needed to believe they could survive this, because the moment they stopped believing, the position would collapse. The major assault came around 0430 hours, perhaps 90 minutes before dawn. The Japanese hit the entire perimeter simultaneously in a coordinated attack that should have overwhelmed the Marine positions through sheer numbers. They came up the slopes in groups of 10 or 15, covered by machine gun fire from the surrounding ridges, screaming to intimidate and coordinate their movements. Pope's Marines fired back with everything they had left. Men who'd been conserving ammunition for hours suddenly emptied their rifles in seconds, shooting at shadows and muzzle flashes, trying to break the attack before it reached the summit. The noise was overwhelming. Grenades detonated in chains. Machine guns hammered from multiple directions. Rifles cracked in rapid fire. And underneath it all, the sound of men screaming orders in 2 languages, of boots scrambling on coral, of the wounded crying for help that wouldn't come. The Japanese reached the Marine positions. They came over the coral lip, and suddenly it wasn't a firefight anymore. It was hand-to-hand combat in the darkness. Men grappling with enemies they could barely see, using rifles as clubs, knives as primary weapons, anything that could kill at arm's length. Pope saw a Marine drive his K-bar into a Japanese soldier's chest, saw another Marine wrestling on the ground with an enemy, their hands locked around each other's throats. He shot a Japanese soldier who was bayoneting one of his men, then turned and shot another who was climbing over a pile of coral 15 feet away. His rifle locked open on an empty magazine. He had no more ammunition. The rifle was useless now. He pulled his pistol and kept firing, but a pistol in a night fight was barely better than throwing rocks. The effective range was measured in feet, not yards. He could see his Marines running out of ammunition all along the line. Men were fighting with entrenching tools, with bare hands, with rocks. The defense was collapsing not because the Marines lacked courage, but because they lacked bullets. And then, impossibly, the Japanese withdrew. They pulled back from the summit, regrouped on the lower slopes, and paused. Pope didn't understand why until he checked his watch and realized dawn was approaching. The Japanese didn't want to be caught on the slopes in daylight when American artillery could see them clearly. They'd retreated to prepare for another assault, or perhaps to wait for Marine reinforcements to appear so they could ambush the relief column. Either way, Company C had perhaps 30 minutes before the sun rose and revealed just how desperate their situation had become. Pope walked the perimeter in the pre-dawn darkness and conducted a final count. Company C, which had landed on Peleliu with 235 Marines, which had climbed Hill 100 with 90 Marines, now consisted of approximately 24 Marines capable of fighting. Many were wounded. All were out of ammunition. They'd thrown their grenades, fired their rifles dry, and exhausted themselves to the point where some men could barely stand. The position they'd held through the night was littered with spent brass, empty magazines, and the bodies of Japanese soldiers who'd almost taken the ridge. It was a victory in the narrowest sense, the sense that they were still alive and still held the ground. But it wasn't sustainable. The next attack would finish them. Dawn broke over Peleliu with the kind of crystalline clarity that made everything visible for miles. Pope stood on the summit of Hill 100 and looked out at the surrounding ridges. What he saw made his stomach drop. Japanese positions were everywhere, dozens of them, all with clear lines of sight to his position. Machine gun nests, mortar positions, fighting positions carved into the coral that his Marines had somehow survived walking past in the darkness. And now, in the growing light, those positions were occupied by soldiers preparing to finish what they'd started. Pope knew what was coming next. Artillery. The Japanese would register their guns on Hill 100 and simply pound the position until nothing moved. His Marines had no cover deep enough to protect them from airbursts. They had no ammunition to suppress the Japanese positions. They couldn't retreat because the cliffs behind them were impassable in daylight. They were trapped on a coral ridge with nowhere to go and nothing to fight with. The first artillery shells arrived around 0600 hours. They were ranging shots, brackets that walked across the ridge as Japanese forward observers adjusted their fire. The shells detonated in the coral with tremendous force, throwing up fountains of rock fragments that were as dangerous as shrapnel. Pope ordered his Marines into the deepest positions available, told them to stay low, to cover their heads, to survive the next few minutes because that was all he could promise them. The shells came in steadily now, walking back and forth across the summit in a methodical pattern designed to eliminate every living thing. The coral absorbed some of the blast force but turned each explosion into a shotgun burst of rock fragments that scoured the position. Marines pressed themselves into depressions barely deep enough to hide a man's body and prayed that mathematics would spare them. Some were hit. Pope heard men screaming over the sound of explosions, heard voices calling for corpsmen who couldn't reach them through the barrage. He couldn't help them. Nobody could help them. They could only endure and hope the artillery stopped before it killed them all. It stopped around 0630 hours. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Pope's ears were ringing so badly he couldn't hear his own voice. He stood up slowly, checking himself for wounds he might not have felt, and looked around at what remained of his company. The Marines who could still stand were pulling themselves out of their positions, helping the wounded, counting the living. Pope counted 14 Marines standing. 14 men out of 235 who'd landed 4 days ago. 14 men who'd held a coral ridge through a night that should have killed them all. They stood on Hill 100 in the early morning light, filthy and bloody and out of ammunition, and waited for orders that Pope knew would never come. Battalion couldn't reinforce them. The route was too exposed, the Japanese positions too strong. Company C was being written off, sacrificed to hold terrain that probably didn't matter anymore. Pope understood this with absolute clarity. They were going to die on this ridge unless they did something radical. He made the decision without consulting anyone. There was no time for discussion and no point in debate. They were withdrawing. They were abandoning Hill 100 and fighting their way back to friendly lines before the Japanese launched another assault or the artillery resumed. It was technically a retreat, technically abandoning an objective they'd been ordered to hold, but Pope didn't care about technicalities anymore. His responsibility was to his Marines, to the 14 men who'd survived the night because they trusted his leadership. He wasn't going to let them die for a ridge that couldn't be held. He gathered his Marines and explained the plan in simple terms. They would wait until smoke covered the position, then they would move down the slope together, staying low, moving fast, heading for the nearest friendly lines roughly 800 yards away. They would carry the wounded. They would leave nothing for the Japanese except empty positions and spent brass. And they would move on his command, not before, because timing was everything. Pope radioed Battalion and requested smoke. He didn't ask permission to withdraw. He didn't explain his reasoning. He simply stated that Company C was departing Hill 100 and needed covering smoke to mask their movement. There was a long pause on the radio. Then someone, probably a staff officer who'd never climbed that ridge, started to argue. Pope cut him off. He stated the situation in terms that left no room for debate. Company C had 14 men standing, no ammunition, no water, and Japanese positions on 3 sides preparing to overrun them. They'd held the objective for 12 hours. They'd accomplished the mission. Now they were leaving. The radio went quiet for a moment. Then a different voice came through, calmer, older, probably someone with combat experience. The voice acknowledged Pope's message and promised smoke in 5 minutes. That was all Pope needed. The smoke rounds came in exactly on schedule, white phosphorus shells that burst over Hill 100 and created a thick artificial fog that reduced visibility to a few yards. Pope gave the order and Company C moved. They went down the slope in a ragged line, helping the wounded, stumbling over loose coral, descending as fast as their exhausted bodies would allow. Japanese soldiers on the surrounding ridges fired into the smoke, but they were shooting blind, hoping to hit something by chance. A few bullets cracked past Pope's head. Someone behind him grunted and fell, then got back up and kept moving. They reached the base of the ridge and kept going, moving across open ground toward distant positions where Marines were waving them in, providing covering fire, shouting encouragement that Pope couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. They covered the 800 yards in perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When Pope finally reached friendly lines and collapsed behind a pile of coral, he realized he was shaking. His hands were trembling so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. One of his Marines tried to help him and found that his own hands were shaking just as badly. They sat together in silence, too tired to speak, too traumatized to process what they'd survived. Company C was officially out of the fight. Of the 235 Marines who'd landed on September 15th, 14 had walked off Hill 100. The others were dead, wounded, or scattered across the battlefield. Pope never learned the exact casualty count because the numbers became abstract after a certain point, just statistics in a report that someone at division headquarters would file away. What mattered was simpler and more terrible. He'd brought men into battle and most of them hadn't come back. That knowledge would follow him for the rest of his life, through the remainder of the war, through his return home, through decades of trying to reconcile what he'd done with what had been necessary. The Battle of Peleliu continued for another 2 months. The 4-day operation stretched into 73 days of brutal fighting that accomplished very little of strategic value. The island was secured at a cost of nearly 10,000 American casualties. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated, their bodies left in the caves and ridges where they'd chosen to die. And somewhere in those casualty reports, in the administrative aftermath of the battle, someone noticed what Company C had done on Hill 100. Captain Everett Pope received the Medal of Honor for his actions during the night of September 19th and the morning of September 20th. The citation mentioned his aggressive leadership, his tactical innovation with the rock-throwing deception, and his refusal to abandon his position until ordered to withdraw. It was formally presented months later in a ceremony that Pope barely remembered. He stood at attention while someone read the citation aloud, while photographers captured the moment for newspapers back home, while officers he'd never met shook his hand and told him he was a hero. Pope accepted the medal because refusing would dishonor the Marines who'd died. But he never felt like a hero. He felt like a man who'd survived when better men hadn't, who'd made impossible decisions under impossible circumstances, who'd thrown rocks at an enemy because he'd run out of bullets. The medal was recognition, but it wasn't redemption. Nothing could redeem what had happened on that ridge. The 14 Marines who survived the night on Hill 100 scattered after the war. Some went home and tried to rebuild lives interrupted by combat. Others stayed in the Marine Corps, finding that civilian life felt hollow after what they'd experienced. A few never made it home, killed in subsequent battles before the war ended. Pope tried to stay in touch with them, tried to maintain the connection forged in combat, but it was difficult. What they'd shared on that ridge wasn't something that translated to letters or occasional phone calls. It existed in a space beyond words, in the understanding that comes from surviving something that should have killed you, from watching men you loved die while you lived. The survivors understood each other in ways that nobody else could, but that understanding was built on trauma, and trauma isn't a foundation for lasting relationships. Eventually, the phone calls became less frequent. The letters stopped. The Marines who'd held Hill 100 became men living separate lives, connected only by memories they'd rather forget. Pope died decades after the war, an old man who'd lived a full life despite carrying Peleliu with him every day. In his later years, he occasionally spoke about the battle carefully to historians and veterans groups who wanted to understand what had happened on those coral ridges. He never dramatized it. He never claimed it was glorious or meaningful beyond the simple fact that his Marines had done their duty. He talked about the rocks, about the desperate hours when they'd thrown coral chunks into the darkness and prayed the Japanese would think they were grenades. He talked about the ammunition running out, about fighting with knives and fists when the guns went empty. He talked about the 14 men who'd walked off that ridge and the many more who hadn't. And when people asked him what he'd learned from the experience, what wisdom he'd gained from leading men through an impossible night, he gave answers that disappointed those seeking inspiration. He said he'd learned that war was chaos, that leadership was about making the least terrible decision available, that courage was just fear held long enough to do what needed doing. He said he'd learned that medals didn't change what happened, that being called a hero didn't make the dead come back, that surviving didn't mean you'd won anything except more time to remember. The Marines who died on and around Hill 100 are buried in cemeteries across America and in military cemeteries in the Pacific. Their names are carved on memorials that most people walk past without stopping. They were young men, most of them, barely old enough to drink legally, who died on an island they'd never heard of until they were ordered to invade it. They died because someone decided Peleliu mattered strategically, even though historians later concluded the island could have been bypassed entirely. They died because the intelligence was wrong about Japanese defensive tactics, because the 4-day estimate was catastrophically optimistic, because the coral ridges provided perfect defensive terrain that aerial bombardment couldn't neutralize. They died for all the reasons men die in war: bad luck, enemy action, exhaustion, equipment failure, and the simple mathematics of combat where someone has to be in the wrong place when the bullet or shell arrives. Their deaths weren't glorious. They were violent and terrifying and often lonely, happening in the dark or in coral caves where their bodies weren't recovered for weeks. But they mattered because they were Marines doing what Marines do, holding impossible positions because they were ordered to hold them, trusting that their sacrifice meant something even when the meaning wasn't clear. Hill 100 still exists. The coral ridge where Company C fought is still there on Peleliu, worn by decades of tropical weather but recognizable to anyone who knows the history. Veterans occasionally return to walk the ground, to stand where they fought, to pay respects to the men who didn't leave. The ridge is quiet now. The bunkers and fighting positions have collapsed. The jungle has reclaimed much of the battlefield. But the coral is still sharp, still cuts hands that touch it, still speaks to the kind of terrain the Marines had to cross and hold. Standing on that ridge, looking out at the surrounding hills where Japanese positions dominated every approach, it becomes clear how desperate the situation was, how close Company C came to being annihilated, how remarkable it is that anyone survived at all. The tactical absurdity of the position is obvious with hindsight and the luxury of not being under fire. The ridge was a death trap, isolated and exposed, untenable for any length of time. But orders aren't written with perfect information, and battles aren't fought with hindsight. Men do what they're told with what they have, and on September 19, 1944, what Company C had was courage, discipline, and rocks. The story of Hill 100 deserves to be remembered not because it was unique, but because it was representative. Every battle produces moments like this, small unit actions where men accomplish impossible things through desperation and leadership and blind determination. Most of these actions never receive recognition beyond the unit level. They become stories told around campfires or in veterans' halls, embellished slightly with each retelling until the facts blur into mythology. But the essential truth remains. War strips away everything except what men are willing to do for each other. On that ridge, Marines threw rocks because they'd run out of bullets. They fought hand-to-hand because the rocks ran out. They held because they refused to abandon the men beside them. That's not heroism in the Hollywood sense. It's something darker and more profound, the human capacity to endure horror because giving up means letting down the people who depend on you. Pope understood this. His Marines understood this. They didn't need medals or monuments to validate what they'd done. They needed to survive the night, and they did, and that was enough. What stays with people who hear this story isn't the tactical details or the award citations. It's the image of exhausted Marines throwing rocks in the darkness, of desperation so complete that coral chunks became weapons, of a night so long that dawn seemed like a myth. It's the knowledge that warfare can be reduced to its most primitive elements, that all the technology and training and doctrine in the world eventually gives way to men fighting with whatever they can grab. And it's the question that follows anyone who thinks seriously about combat. What would you do in that position, isolated and out of ammunition, surrounded by enemies who want you dead, responsible for lives you can't protect with the resources you don't have? Most people hope they'd never have to find out. The Marines on Hill 100 didn't have that luxury. They found out, and it nearly destroyed them, and some small part of it followed them home and never left. If this story affected you, if you felt something listening to what those Marines endured, take a moment to engage. Subscribe to this channel so you can hear more stories that need to be told. Like this video to help it reach others who might need to hear it. And share your thoughts in the comments. What moment from this story stayed with you? Was it the rocks thrown in darkness? The dwindling count of survivors? The impossible decision to withdraw? Or was it something else, something personal that connected with your own understanding of sacrifice and duty? These stories matter because they remind us what war actually costs, not in strategic terms or budget numbers, but in human terms that can't be calculated. The men who fought on Hill 100 didn't ask to be remembered as heroes. They just asked to be remembered. So remember them. Remember what they did. Remember what it cost. And when you're done remembering, pass the story forward, because the best memorial we can build for the dead is making sure their sacrifices aren't forgotten by the living.